On March 24th, 1999, NATO intervened in a huge way in Yugoslavia. So this bombing campaign lasted 77 days, destroyed what was left of Yugoslavia at the time because the war had been raging for several years before that, with NATO's indirect involvement, especially the United States's. And the destruction of Yugoslavia is really a story not just in the end of a particular society in the region, a nation in the region that was seen as a problem after the fall of the Soviet Union, seen as a problem by NATO. It was one of NATO's first campaigns after the fall of the Soviet Union, military campaigns, an offensive campaign, so to speak. And its implications go far beyond just Yugoslavia, even though the loss of Yugoslavia still reverberates across, especially the region, but the entire world, as a defeat in the attempts of the global majority to pave their own way out of the dominance and influence of American hegemony. So Russia, of course, is very interested in this anniversary of the bombing of Yugoslavia. And you might ask, well, why? A big reason for this is because Russia has declared a state of war. This is a relatively new assertion. It was made on March 22nd, just a day or less than a day before the horrific Crocus attack in Moscow. And this state of war has everything to do with NATO. It's everything to do with NATO. That's because Russia has declared it is in a state of war, not because it's not trying to wage a special military operation in Ukraine and keep the war at a level, keep its military intervention at a level that keeps the door open for diplomacy. Russia has been doing that since the very beginning. But it's because NATO is so directly involved in Ukraine that now we are having NATO member states like France make direct threats to Russia of military intervention, not unlike what we saw during this period when the US and NATO invaded Yugoslavia. So the history here is very important to Russia. So let's look at Russia's perspective on Yugoslavia. They posted this article, Ruins of Yugoslavia, How Russia Learned That NATO Poses a Threat. The U.S. military bloc's illegal strikes on Belgrade in the spring of 1999 forever changed relations between the West and Moscow. So Russia is seeing this as a huge change in the historical calculus in the region. And mind you, it's not just Russia that was affected. There were several Chinese journalists who were killed by NATO bombs after the Chinese embassy, was struck by sorties May 7th, May 7th, 1999. So, happens also to be my date of birth. So, let's talk about what Russia's perspective is. So on March 24th, 1999, Elena Milinchich, a student, was at home with her sister and a friend in Belgrade. Suddenly, the quiet evening was interrupted by an air raid siren. The girls quickly hid under the table. It wasn't the safest place, but they had gotten lucky. Their part of the city wasn't attacked. Over the next 77 days, these girls and other Belgrade residents became better at hiding from the bombs which threatened to kill them every day. The raids were part of NATO's military operation against Yugoslavia, a campaign that shook up the world order and not just in the Balkans. So the preconditions were that the Kosovo problem goes many centuries back. Located in the southwest of Serbia on the border of Albania, the Kosovo region was historically inhabited by two Balkan peoples, the Serbs and the Albanians. The Serbs consider the region as a major part of the country's history and culture. However, Albanians have also lived there for centuries. By the mid-19th century, there were about as many Albanians as Serbs in Kosovo. Ethnic strife was a common problem in the Balkans, retaining their particular cultural characteristics. Serbs, Albanians, Croats, Gypsies, and Muslim Serbs lived side by side for centuries. Conflicts between them, nonetheless, resulted in brutal massacres. During World War II, the Balkans were occupied by Germany and Italy, and a brutal regime was established in Kosovo. Serbs were expelled from the region and many were killed. After the war, when Josip Broz Tito, came to power in Yugoslavia and put more wood on the fire, he did not allow Serbian refugees to return to the region and wanted to use Kosovo to pressure Albania. He hoped the region would become a bridge between the two countries. However, the plan fell through and the area continued to be Albanian. By the time Yugoslavia collapsed, Kosovo's population consisted of 75% Albanians and 20% Serbs. The rest were minorities. Many Albanian nationalist organizations emerged in the 1980s. At first, they committed minor offenses like arsons, beatings, graffiti, and so on against the Serbian population. However, from the 90s forward, Kosovo undertook attempts to break away from Yugoslavia, and the Kosovo Albanians gravitated towards Albania. During Tito's rule, the region's nationalist intelligentsia considerably increased in number and laid the ideological ground for secessionist projects. So there was an increased fervor for independence. And of course, we have the KLA, which arose from this, the Kosovo Liberation Army, after the 1991 independence referendum. Now, mind you, the Kosovo Liberation Army was supported by the West, and it launched a full-scale guerrilla terrorist war against the Serb population. By 1998, Belgrade realized it had lost control of the situation and launched a military operation against the KLA in Kosovo. So the Western media covered this small-scale yet brutal war in a surprisingly one-sided manner. The operation conducted by Serbian forces was indeed violent, but we need to keep in mind that they fought against a terrorist group. People in Europe, however, in the US, were only shown how violent Serbian nationalists were to peaceful Albanian peasants. EU and US officials pressured Belgrade to stop the bloodshed. No one made the same demands in regard to KLA militants or complained that Albania was pumping Kosovo with weapons and training militants. The West was determined to dismantle Yugoslavia, so it supported separatists. The private military company MPRI, which had earlier helped train Croatian armed forces in their fight against the Serbs, soon took over the training of the terrorists. And mind you, this support of Croatia during this conflict involved a lot of descendants of Nazis. Mind you, that this was an area that was brutally occupied by the Nazis, by both and fascists, so by both Italy and Germany. So there's a long history here that this article necessarily isn't going to get into, but it's worth noting that Serbian nationalism here is not talking about like a fascist kind of nationalism, but those who opposed it, like in Croatia, you could say, were being empowered by the West based on a very, very reactionary ideology. So the president of Yugoslavia, Slobodan Milosevic, saw that he was backed into a corner, but could not just hand over Kosovo. Meanwhile, the war gained momentum. Acts of violence against civilian Serbs became widespread, and the operations of Serbian security forces became more violent. The Serbs tried to deport many Albanians, but this was convenient for Albania since KLA recruiters were waiting for newcomers to draft into the army. So it was getting out of control. And of course, we never heard of the victims during this time. I was very young at this time, but you still don't hear about how Serbia was so terrorized by these operations. I mean, it was a full-scale war, and this so-called guerrilla wars they're calling NRT, I mean, it was terrorist activity. It was not a liberation war by any stretch of the imagination. Serbian people suffered the most. The KLA is akin to what you would say Al-Qaeda or ISIS or these kind of forces are in West Asia, right? A paramilitary force, a proxy force, armed and really carrying forward a very vicious agenda. So one incident that became known as the Rakic massacre clearly demonstrates how confusing the war was and how hard it was to tell who was right and who was wrong. In 1999 of January, a Serbian policeman was killed near the village of Rakic. Soon afterwards, Serbian special police entered the village. EU observers and journalists were warned about the situation in advance. An hours-long battle began in the course where 45 Albanians died. KLA fighters acknowledged the loss of 8 fighters, but the Serbs insisted that most or even all of the dead were militants and that they died in combat and were not victims of ethnic cleansing, while expert opinions were divided. The Battle of Rakic was an example of a tragic drama that unfolds in the course of guerrilla warfare and is quite common in counterinsurgency operations. In such situations, there's no way to establish truth. However, in the spring of 1999, Western politicians presented the tragedy in Rakic as a massacre that demanded an immediate response from the international community. So there were then negotiations in Rambouillet. Serbian and Albanian delegations were not able to come to an agreement. The Serbs were ready for a ceasefire and agreed to grant Kosovo autonomous status, but did not want a foreign military contingent on its territory. In response, NATO accused the Serbs of disrupting negotiations. Yugoslavia and Milosevic were vilified in the press, and NATO started preparing a military operation. The UN Security Council did not sanction the use of military force, but most likely one of the goals of the operation was to demonstrate NATO's readiness to act without the approval of the international community. Milosevic was told to immediately withdraw Serbian forces from Kosovo and transfer control of the region to NATO's international contingent. This time, the demands were backed by military force. It was really not negotiations at all. This was a kangaroo process. This was all about using a pretext, using misinformation. Does it sound familiar? Like what's going on in Ukraine right now? Using misinformation to justify greater and greater intervention. And that's why this is so important to understand that Yugoslavia was not just some anomalous case of ethnic strife, right? Sometimes it's seen in that vacuum. No, this was really a manufactured conflict that would not have taken place in the same way, even if there were divisions and issues within Yugoslav society. There were, but it wouldn't have taken place in the way that it did without NATO's deep assistance, dare I say, without its significant leadership in sparking this war. So NATO bombings in Yugoslavia started on March 24th, 1999. The U.S. played a key role in the operation, but a total of 13 countries were involved. The alliance did not plan to conduct a ground operation, but made extensive use of its air force and cruise missiles to attack the country. The forces were incomparable. NATO used 1,000 planes and helicopters, mainly from military bases in Italy, and the aircraft carrier USS Theodore Roosevelt. The KLA had several thousand fighters, but the combat capability of these units was low. Compared to NATO's air fleet, Yugoslavia's forces were weak. The Air Force had only 11 relatively modern fighter aircraft and several outdated missile systems that had been supplied by the USSR, the Soviet Union, many years ago. The alliance started the operation by launching several dozen Tomahawk cruise missiles. Then the attack aircraft started dropping bombs. The first goal was to suppress the Yugoslav missile defense system. The strikes were successful. Serbian anti-aircraft gunners tried their best to fight enemy forces. For example, Air Defense Officer Zoltan Dani was able to shoot down an inconspicuous and theoretically invisible F-117 stealth attack aircraft. However, these minor victories could not change the course of the operation. The Serbs could only act from the ground and sporadically attack enemy aircraft using air defense systems. Serbian pilots even tried to attack the enemy using fighter aircraft. This was indeed a courageous feat, but practically useless from a military point of view. In the entire course of the operation, NATO lost only 3 aircraft and 2 helicopters. Why do you think the Russian side is focusing on this? Because what do you think Russia learned here? Russia learned that you had to have an equal, if not a measurably demonstrative and strong deterrence force to ensure that a Yugoslavia does not happen to Russia. This is, I believe, going to be the point. I can't predict what this article is going to say, but I believe that's the point why this article is focusing so much on the military aspect of this. After the missile defense systems were suppressed, NATO resorted to terrorist-style bombings. The attacks on the troops weren't very effective, and the Yugoslav units retained their combat capability until the end of the war. About 30 combat vehicles were destroyed, and several hundred Serbian soldiers and officers were killed and wounded. Considering the fact that over 90,000 servicemen and police officers were stationed in Kosovo and another 65,000 defended the rest of their country, the losses were not very great. In other words, NATO strikes disabled the Air Force and air defense systems, but did not affect the combat capability of the troops in a major way. But while they were ineffective in that way, that might not have been the point. The point might have been that civilian infrastructure was the target because it suffered major damage as a result of NATO bombings, and it was a lot harder to conceal a bridge or a TV tower than a tank. Bridges, industrial facilities, and telecommunication systems were attacked every day. Even targets that were not considered strategically important to NATO were often hit by mistake. For example, on April 14, 1999, an F-16 fighter jet attacked a convoy of civilian Albanian refugees near Gakov. Another time, a sniper strike killed 73 people. And when an intelligence munition system tried to find military equipment at a Chinese embassy, 3 people were killed. According to the various sources, the number of victims varies from 500 to 5,700 people. Many buildings in Belgrade remain ruined to this day. And look at this picture. This is March 24th, 2013, looking at a building that had still not been rebuilt during NATO's bombing campaign. I mean, that's just an astounding sight, to say the least, because that is nearly 14 years later. Throughout this time, battles between Serbian troops and KLA fighters continued on the ground. Several dozen volunteers from Russia participated in the fighting, and at least 3 died. Despite NATO's superiority, the Serbs managed to defeat the Kosovo Liberation Army on the ground. The victory was impressive, but alas, totally useless. At the time, so this is what's important, because they're going to talk about achievements of this, what this all means, okay? So they're going to talk about Russia's side of this, how Russia views this. And at the time, Russia was undergoing very difficult economic times, and its support for Yugoslavia was reduced to just symbolic gestures. After the start of air raids, the parliament of Yugoslavia wanted to join the union between Russia and Belarus, but Russian President Boris Yeltsin blocked the initiative. There you have Boris Yeltsin once again with another feather in his very alcohol-filled, alcohol-stenched cap. He blocked a possibility of that union. Thousands of people protested at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow every day. Once an activist even brought a grenade launcher and tried to attack the embassy. Unfortunately, apart from protesting and loudly condemning the events, there was nothing Russia could do. In those years, Russia's economy was in shreds, and unlike today, this just wasn't a story made up by Western politicians and media. At that time, the economic crisis was real, and the army had suffered a humiliating defeat in Chechnya. There was nothing Russia could do to prevent NATO's operation. I mean, yeah, nothing they could do to prevent it. On June 1st, Milosevic agreed to all of NATO's demands. The alliance's peacekeeping forces entered Kosovo, and Serbian troops withdrew from the region. As Yugoslav troops withdrew from Kosovo, ethnic cleansing began. In the coming months, over 1,700 people, almost all of them Serbs or other national minorities, were killed by militants or went missing. The majority of the remaining Serbs fled. According to various sources, between 200,000 and 350,000 people left the region, including Serbs and other minorities. KLA militants smashed cultural monuments, burned down churches, and destroyed anything that remained of the enemy. Does that sound like something familiar? Because when the coup in Ukraine happened in 2014, afterwards, what did we see happen all over Kiev? Everything Russia began to be destroyed. Monuments to the Soviet Union began to be taken down, despite their historic relevance and their cultural relevance. This is kind of par for the course for how NATO does things, and this is why we should not trust anything NATO says about any force that they support, because usually their attempts to whitewash, let's say, Ukrainian forces with this air of democracy is always simply a lie. All right. And Serbia teaches us that. And Yugoslavia teaches us that. As for NATO troops, they did not prevent or stop the purge in any way. Today, some Serbs remain in Kosovo still, most living in a small enclave near the Serbian border. Negotiations on the status of the region did not yield results for several years. In 2008, Kosovo declared independence and has been recognized as an independent republic by most Western states. Unsurprisingly, problems in the region did not end with the expulsion of the Serbs. To this day, Kosovo is a poor country with major corruption issues. The U.S. took an active part in the reconstruction of Kosovo, but the region was mostly used by businessmen and officials for personal enrichment. Kind of similar to what happened to Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union, before the advent of Putin's leadership. Okay, this is how the U.S. does things. It destroys countries, dismembers them, and then plunders them. This is not just a political victory. This is not just a political objective, right? The military's political objective always includes, when it comes to NATO, the plunder of these countries at the behest of their own financial and corporate interests. We always have to remember that about war. Many of them have profited from murky schemes, including former U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, Ding Dong, the witch is dead, who owned a share of the only private mobile network operator in the region and later tried to grab a piece of a state-owned company. Coincidentally, Albright's daughter is the exclusive director of a corporation that distributes grants to poor countries, including Kosovo. In Kosovo, there are over 800,000 migrant workers per 1.8 million inhabitants. Wow. Moreover, the republic has turned into a stronghold of the Albanian mafia. Even the Western press was forced to admit the failure of state building in Kosovo. And that's because they don't give a damn about state building. There's no, that's all just all the same. It means nothing, state building. The only point to NATO wars is domination, dismemberment, destabilization for their interests, not the interest of the state. State building, that's just for the masses. A few years later, after the events of 1999, Montenegro peacefully broke away from Yugoslavia and the latter ceased to exist. Serbian President Milosevic was overthrown in 2000 as a result of unrest in Belgrade and was secretly extradited to the International Criminal Tribunal in The Hague. In 2006, before the trial's conclusion, he died at age 64 in the UN prison, and immediately suspicions were raised, which have persisted over how he died. Yeah, some people believe he was assassinated. And that was because this always happens, right? Osama bin Laden, Milosevic, a lot of forces that maybe have inconvenient information, like Muammar Gaddafi, right, was sodomized and assassinated. A lot of people who have inconvenient truths to tell, the United States doesn't want them going in front of The Hague and giving their side of the story because while Milosevic would have been likely found guilty of crimes that are very politicized in nature, he would still have the ability through his defense to promote a narrative and information and facts that are very inconvenient to this NATO war. So it's very, very reasonable to have suspicions over why he died. So, what conclusions did the world draw? And how about Russia? The bombing of Yugoslavia was an important and apparently highly underestimated turning point in relations between Russia and the West. Both the Russian elite and society painfully reacted to the tragic events in Yugoslavia. This may sound strange, but Russia once harbored idealistic sentiments about the great Western democracies. When the Cold War ended, it seemed the US and NATO were unfairly slandered by Soviet propaganda. Unfortunately, there was a lot of truth to the Soviet propaganda. Unfortunately, or fortunately, for the whatever your view is, I guess. For Russia, it was quite a painful reminder, or I should say, that's what I'm saying. But for Russia, it was quite painful to realize that world politics still resembled an aquarium full of hungry sharks. Moreover, Russia traditionally had close and friendly relations with Serbia and the Serbian people, but now the Serbs are publicly attacked and humiliated. The elites had their own reason for concern. The Russian government regarded Russia-U.S. and Russia-West relations in an idealistic way, but in 1999, Moscow clearly saw that international law doesn't provide any guarantees on the global arena. Yugoslavia was destroyed without any serious grounds simply because Western politicians had decided so. The country lost part of its territory, and the cut-off enclave was subjected to ethnic cleansing while the world turned a blind eye. All this was done under the guise of a rules-based international order. Territorial integrity was considered one of the inviolable principles of international law, but it too was trampled. Moreover, in the general context of the Balkan wars and conflicts, all the blame was put on Yugoslavia and Serbia, regardless of whether Serbs were rebels who fought against the government or vice versa. None of this resembled justice or law. It became clear that neither agreements nor international law could protect any country, including Russia, from external military force, and that countries could only rely on the political situation and their own ability to cope with threats. Ding, 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 ding. That's a huge lesson. It became clear, let's read that again, that neither agreements nor international law could protect any country, including Russia, from external military force, and that countries could only rely on the political situation and their own ability to handle threats. So, what does that tell you? It tells you that Russia learned through Yugoslavia that if it was going to make itself a puppet, it was going to slovenly follow the collective West down whatever path it wanted for Russia. This would mean it would not be safe from the very fate that Yugoslavia had undergone. And mind you, around this time, there was the Wolfowitz doctrine, which had been going around, right, during the Clinton administration. So Paul Wolfowitz, right, he is this long time, he wrote this after the Cold War. His doctrine in 1992, which was released by the Defense Department, had as its, as head of the um, as part of the Undersecretary for Policy in the Pentagon, Wolfowitz had as an agenda, and the people backing him, the balkanization of Russia. There was explicit mention of not allowing Russia to rise up again. It wouldn't say Russia in particular, but it said in the post-Soviet kind of post-Cold War calculus that there will be no rise of any kind of similar force. And that was a direct targeting of Russia to keep it weak. And so Russia not only had that to think about and chew on, but also then, just 7 years later, saw that doctrine be enforced in Yugoslavia. So this realization was doubly important since Russia had similar problem with insurgents in Chechnya. The Kremlin could not help but think that if the West could use this pretext to attack Yugoslavia, it could use the same strategy against Russia. On the other hand, Moscow came to reasonable conclusion that if the arbitrator twists the rules as he likes, he loses authority. Their sarcastic expression, "You don't understand, this case is different," which implies the hypocrisy of those who condemn others for certain actions while engaging in condemned behavior, remains popular on Russian internet to this day. For the Russian political elite, Kosovo became a classic example of a different case. Western journalists and politicians often emphasize that the situation in Kosovo was unique. However, the ill-fated region was obviously no different from dozens of other hotspots. Why was Kosovo a special case? Why weren't Transnistria, South Ossetia, uh, Abkhazia, Nagorno-Karabakh, Serbian Krajina, or Catalonia just as exceptional? What other situations will be considered special, and what other conflicts between authorities and separatists will be sufficient grounds for NATO to carry out bombings and allow ethnic cleansing? The bombing of Belgrade destroyed the image of the rules-based international order. Of course, it wasn't the last time that this rule of law and the demands of justice were ignored by Western countries after the collapse of the Soviet Union, as the Iraq War followed only 4 years later. However, the events in Yugoslavia had clearly demonstrated that a country that wants to protect its sovereignty from external threats can only rely on its own strength and that of its allies or proven allies. So that was written by a Russian historian, Roman Shumov, for RT, formerly Russia Today. And the reason why I shared that is because, while it didn't give the most comprehensive historical analysis, mind you, it did give a good take, I believe, on why Russia is concerned about NATO. Because, as I said before, they have declared a state of war, right? Russia has said they are in a state of war, and that's because NATO is involved in Ukraine. But it's not just about Ukraine. I want to pull up one last thing to kind of make this point or bring this point home. Okay. NATO expansion. Here's Stop the War UK. So Stop the War UK is this graphic I want to show you on NATO expansion, because oftentimes you hear, well, NATO expansion is no threat. If you couple the intervention in Yugoslavia, the war in Yugoslavia, with NATO expansion, you can see, and then not to mention what happens in Ukraine over a decade and a half later, then you get to see how, putting all these things together, it is indeed not just reasonable, but correct to assert that NATO expansion is a threat to Russia. And Russia then has learned from Yugoslavia and the NATO war there that if it is not strong enough, if it is not militarily prepared, if it is not taking care of sovereignty and ensuring that it is that it is a reliable partner on the world stage to the global majority, that all of these factors would then lead to a Yugoslav possible situation, right? A Balkanization effort by NATO. So here is the graphic. Okay, so I'm actually let's just let it play once. So here you see over the years, and it keeps going. So there you have, so of 1949 to 1952, you see that on the periphery of Western Europe and the Mediterranean, you have Turkey and Portugal and countries like that joining after the end of World War II. Then 1955, you have, of course, West Germany there. 1982, you have Spain joining. Then, of course, you have the fall of the wall in 1990. And, of course, Germany becomes so-called united. Then you have Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary join in 1999. Then in 2004, look at that. You have Romania, Bulgaria, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, all these countries on the border, mind you. These countries rest right on Russia's border. This is Russia. and this is Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, of course, is not too far off. So then you have 2009, of course. You have smaller countries down here based on the split up of Yugoslavia, Albania, Montenegro. So that stops there. But of course, we've had Sweden and Finland also ascended into or given a session into NATO. So, and those countries are indeed, especially, I think Finland shares a border with Russia. So, and Sweden is right around the corner. So we're talking about major expansion on the part of NATO, the Yugoslav War being a huge historical event, this destructive war that killed. I mean, the civilian toll, there's debates about it, but we can bet that thousands died in a 77-day bombing campaign by NATO, and that you had TV stations, bridges, civilian infrastructure, hospitals, schools destroyed. People were put in a state of suffering, a mass suffering. And of course, a country that once had a high standard of living. People in Yugoslavia had a high standard of living. Life expectancy was high for the region. And for many years, there had been, of course, there were issues, but for many years there was unity. Okay, and it wasn't until late 80s and 90s when there were geopolitical issues, where there was more opening up on the part of Yugoslavia, when there was more economic dislocation. This was the post 1970s world order was much more difficult economically in many ways than the period after World War II. For many countries to not just maintain a standard of living, but to hold off the pressure from an increasingly militaristic and exploitative collective West led by the United States, because the United States had lots of plans, not just for the Soviet Union's end, not just the end of the so-called Cold War to defeat the Soviet Union, but to really then turn toward Yugoslavia. A big reason why Yugoslavia began to be a problem for the United States and the United States and NATO's eyes is because the Soviet Union was no longer there. And there was no need to have Yugoslavia be some kind of buffer, some kind of neutral buffer between the Soviet Union and the United States. So all of that is to say is that it was a brutal war, and Russia has learned from this. The biggest lesson that Russia came out from this with, and this is so interesting because this basically ended in 1999, 2000, and what happened just after that? Vladimir Putin became the leader of Russia, and for the next 20 plus years, now we're in what, year 23, 24, Vladimir Putin has changed the calculus in Russia in terms of how Russia is ruled. It is no longer a country that sells itself, its sovereignty, its resources, and everything away to the collective West so that Russia can be super exploited while the collective West gets all of, or reaps all of the benefits, or should we say, the elites in the collective West reap all of the benefits. That's no longer happening. That's why NATO wants to see Russia dismembered, a la Yugoslavia. That's why you had Victoria Nuland. How many times was she saying that Russia was in for surprises on the battlefield in Ukraine, despite the fact that Ukraine has been reeling and suffering on the battlefield for quite many months now? But nonetheless, Victoria Nuland admitted herself that this isn't the Russia that the United States had wanted. They wanted Russia to combust, to internally combust, fall apart and collapse, and become a state that Yugoslavia became. One that is dismembered, dislocated, that is ruled by puppets, by people who do not have the best interests of the Russian people, and of course, all of its diversity and all of the diversity of Russia, various ethnic groups, etc. They want all of those people to essentially live in chaos, to live in very small little statelets that can be easily controlled politically. And that would achieve, in the minds of people like Victoria Nuland, the Paul Wolfowitz doctrine. So this has been an agenda for quite some time. And this is what Russia had to learn over the last 20 plus years under the leadership of Vladimir Putin. that it is incredibly important to not just maintain sovereignty and defend sovereignty, but to chart a new world order away from the so-called rules-based international order, to repair the relationship between Russia and China, to ensure that these two countries remain the anchor for the rest of the global majority, to move away from the death inducing tentacles of the US empire and all of its hegemony. This has been the mission of Russia since Vladimir Putin has come into power, and this will continue to be as he enjoys the immense legitimacy of the last presidential election, and as the imperial hegemon, as the United States and Ukraine and all this get desperate, so much so that they're resorting to the most heinous of attacks. So, as we saw in Crocus. So Russia is interested in developing the Russian people. It's interested in defending their interests, and it's interested in being a stable and positive multipolar force on the world stage, even if that means having to get hands dirty. Unfortunately, that's what Ukraine has been all about, needing to put a military force behind these principles when defending them by other means became exhausted and became utterly ineffective. Russia is in a state of war, and it's going to continue to learn from the Yugoslavia case in order to preserve itself and to forward its objectives. And we need to know this because we don't get the Russian side. We don't get that from the mainstream media. And certainly, we know that the only reason Russia has declared a state of war is because NATO is preparing one. Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.